Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be chairing this keynote lecture to be delivered by Professor Michael Woods. Just like to begin with a few words introducing Professor Woods. Michael joined Aberystwyth back in 1996.
20 years ago.
And is currently a professor of human geography at Aber. His research interests focus on rural geography and political geography, and for much of the past decade he's led the department's new political geographies research group. He has a very distinguished back catalogue of publications, far too numerous for me to be able to list here, but some highlights include his book, the monograph Contesting Rurality, Politics in the British Countryside, published in 2005, right the way up to Key Concepts in Rural Geography, published last year.
Well, will be published when we write it.
Will be published. Okay. more to come. Excellent. And Michael was, of course, the recipient of the prestigious John Fraser Award for Research Excellence in Rural Geography by the Association of American Geographers. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Michael, and perhaps we can give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get here until late yesterday, so I missed most of the presentations yesterday, but I've greatly enjoyed listening this morning, and I've been struck by the diversity of presentations this morning, empirically, but also to some degree theoretically. Nonetheless, I think there are common strands I could see coming out of those presentations this morning, which I think I will pick up some of at least this afternoon. Although I perhaps maybe coming at some of those questions from a slightly different theoretical perspective, and I will say more about that, because essentially what I'm doing with this paper is trying to think about a theorisation of work which we are doing, and this is a slightly more of a think piece, but it's a piece of work we've been working on for a year or so on and off now, as part of a project team, and it's still ongoing. Some parts of this certainly are. Some parts of this we've tried before in other conferences. Some parts, the last parts, are this is the first time we're voting these ideas, and they certainly are by no means fully formed. And I would certainly appreciate questions and comments and feedback on some of the things I'm going to suggest as we go through. As I say, we're doing this as part of a project we have at the moment called Global Rural, a 5-year project which we are coming up to almost a halfway point now. And in very broad terms, this is thinking about globalization and its impacts on rural areas around the world, and how globalization is reproduced through rural areas around the world. So these are the kind of research questions which we are addressing. And this is my research team up here, and we are collectively thinking through this process of how do we actually conceptualise these questions? What's our theoretical framework for it? As I'll explain in a moment, we've adopted a broadly assemblage perspective, but having done that, we need to think through still about what precisely does that mean? What variations, what iterations of assemblage thinking do we want to draw upon, and how do we actually translate those into methodologies, into techniques we're going to employ, strategies for analysis, and so on. So we've been working on this. We have, as part of our project practice, we have monthly reading meetings as a project team, and we've been reading some of the broader work around assemblage as well as other concepts, and trying to discuss how do we want to operationalise this, how are we going to do it. So this paper is, in a sense, a product of that process. Our point of departure is the relational critique of globalisation, which has been articulated variously by people like Ashameen, late Doreen Massey, Michael P. Smith and others, which I think is summed up in this quote from Doreen Massey, that globalisation is not a single all-embracing movement, nor should it be imagined as some outward spread from the West and other centres of economic power across a passive surface of space. It is a making of spaces, an active reconfiguration, meeting up through practices and relations of a multitude of trajectories. And this is where that lies the politics. And there's a number of things which I think appeal to us about this relational approach in terms of thinking about globalisation in a rural context. It avoids, I think, some of the fallacies which people easily fall into in thinking about globalisation in rural space. The first being actually that, to conflate globalisation and urbanisation, and to see that there is no urban space we've thinking of before, that we are already urbanised, we just need to do urban research or apply urban theory to this globalised space. The other extreme is to see rural areas as being a kind of refuge from globalisation, which clearly they're not either. Another fallacy is simply to see see rural areas as victims of globalisation, as places which are being impressed by kind of, the imposition of top-down global forces, homogenised forces, which are coming out of some hidden command centre somewhere. And in the face of which rural communities, rural people are powerless. And again, we wanted to contest that. The relational approach gets us into thinking about globalisation as being about the reconfiguration of these relations between places, between spaces, between economies. It gets us to think about how that the global is reproduced through the local. It's not something imposed on the local. And it opens up the whole contingencies of that process of globalisation. It highlights the fact that globalisation is a contested process. However, in turning that position into a body of research, we then still have this question of how do we actually operationalise a relational approach to globalisation in terms of doing this work. And this is where we became attracted to assemblage thinking. And I'm very deliberately using the term assemblage thinking and not assemblage theory, because the more I work with this body of ideas, the more I'm convinced it's not really a theory. Certainly it's not coherent in any way, there's lots of different authors saying different things. And also actually I think its power is not an explanation, which is what I tend to look to theory for. It's an ontology, it's a way of describing the world. And I therefore think it does open up opportunities to actually still draw upon a range of other theories. And there's some debate within kind of assemblage work in terms of the extent to which it is compatible with other theoretical perspectives or a range of theoretical perspectives. We were nonetheless attracted to assemblage thinking for the emphasis it places on emergence, multiplicity and indeterminacy. Within that though we still have the issue of whose assemblage thinking do we use? And although assemblage is a term which certainly in geographical circles has gained currency in recent years and been brought in, and it's a little bit of a buzz term, it's actually used in very diverse ways. And there's different authors that people are drawing upon. So there is a Foucauldian-inspired approach to assemblage. There is a approach to assemblage which is inspired by people like Bruno Latour, who builds very much upon actor network theory. There is a Deleuzian-Guattarian approach to assemblage. And these actually conceive of assemblage and how it works in slightly different ways. In particular, we have tended to use or be guided by the iteration of assemblage theory developed from Deleuze by the Mexican-American writer Manuel de Landa. Not because I necessarily have sympathy with his attempt to create a theory of assemblage, but because I think the way in which he tries to think through the characteristics of assemblage helps to give us I'm going the wrong way there. Where is he okay. Jumping around a little bit here. This helps to I'm not quite sure how I managed to jump off. I'm going to end and start again because we've gone all over the place there. Here we are, sorry. I think what attracts to me is the way in which he talks about attributes of assemblage, which to me is useful in beginning to bring together a framework for analysis. How do we actually analyse assemblages? And what I find useful in De Landa's work is this where he kind of breaks down assemblages to describe them this way. So he posits three co-attributes for assemblages. Firstly, he argues that assemblages are composed of both material and expressive components. And individual components have both material and expressive roles. So material roles are clearly about the utilitarian uses, the function of various components. But expressive roles are more about how they contribute to have a symbolic role, contribute to a sense of identity, and so on. Secondly, an assemblage is given shape, stabilised and destabilised through processes of territorialisation and deterritorialisation. And this may be what I regard as territorialisation in a literal sense, a spatial territorialisation. It has a spatial footnote, occupied space. But it's also territorialisation in a more metaphorical sense in terms of the organisational shape that an assemblage takes, the way it's arranged and what holds it together. Thirdly, an assemblage is given an identity through coding, including practice of naming, classification and rule setting. And then decoding processes dissent from established meanings, break rules and give rise to heterogeneity. So are the key co-attributes which De Lande establishes. You now begin to think about how you may develop an analytical framework from those attributes. And then there's a number of further principles we can take from De Lande's work writing. Firstly, assemblages are dynamic and contingent. They're always in a state of becoming, and this highlights that very much dynamism, that contingency which we were attracted to. Assemblages are engaged in recurrent interactions with other assemblages, from which larger assemblages may emerge. That the components of an assemblage may be detached and plugged into a different assemblage, in which its interactions are different. So we can take something out, there's a degree in which something can be attached, can be captured, can be moved elsewhere. Components can move between assemblages in this way. And finally, assemblages always tend towards internal homogeneity. And as we start to work through the details of this, some of these statements will perhaps be illustrated a bit more. So, having decided to look at an assembly approach, how do we then apply this to globalisation? And there is a body of work on engagement in globalisation by assemblage scholars, but this is rather fragmented and partial in its engagement. Broadly speaking, the work which exists there can be divided into two broad concerns. The first is a concern with what we might call global assemblages, as structures or systems, and in this meaning, assemblage is taken as a noun. As an assemblage is an object which you can look at and you can deconstruct in the way which De Lande has been hinting at. The second concern has been with globalisation, with a process of assembling. And assemblage here is a verb, perhaps truer too, that the original French sense of agencement, as was used in, has been used in much of the original French writing from which these perspectives draw. And I want very briefly, just in order to position this work, run through some of the key uses of assemblage in terms of thinking about globalisation. Perhaps the best known is the work of Saskia Sassen, who in her book In Territory, Authority and Rights talks about global assemblages and talks about cities and territories assemblages. But she's quite clear in the footnote towards the beginning of that her usage of assemblage is profoundly untheoretical compared to other authors. I simply want a dictionary term. So we can just easily throw this out and ignore Sassen's application here. More aligned to assemblage theory or assemblage thinking itself is the formulation by Ong and Collier and the related work to that, where global assemblages are defined as systems that mix technology, politics and actors in diverse configurations that do not follow the other scales or political mappings. Informed particularly by Foucault and concepts of biopolitics and governmentality, the concern of this work is less on global assemblages as structures or on the conditions of their production, but more upon the technological, administrative and ethical regimes that are articulated through them and which reshape ways of ruling and living. It is through these interactions, Collier and Ong suggest, that a global is brought into being, as it's outlined here. The product of these interactions, they say, might be called the actual global, or the global in the space of assemblage. In relationship to the global, the assemblage is not a locality to which broader forces are counterposed, nor is it the structural effect of such forces. An assemblage is the product of multiple dimensions that are not reducible to a single logic. The temporality of assemblage is emergent. It does not always involve new forms, but forms that are shifting in formation or at stake. As a composite concept, the term global assemblage suggests inherent tensions. Global implies broadly encompassing, seamless, and mobile. Assemblage implies heterogeneous, contingent, unstable, partial, and situated. And in rejecting the binary counterposition of the local and global, and in emphasising heterogeneity, contingency, and situatedness, Collier and Ong echo the relational critique of globalisation, and point towards microprocesses and everyday experiences, inscribing, quote, what Deleuze has called little lines of mutation. Little lines of mutation, minor histories that address themselves to the big questions of globalisations in a careful and limited manner. However, while global assemblages in Collier and Ong's formulation may include transnational systems, it is evident here that global is not necessarily defined geographically, but may also be understood as universality, such that global forms, they say, have a distinct capacity for deconceptualisation and recontextualisation, abstractability and movement across diverse social and cultural situations and spheres of life. Thus, for example, they note the example of stem cell research, and they note that this is organised in transnational space, but is also global in another sense, that its significance is not limited by social, cultural, economic formulations. Potentially, they say, stem cell research could be organised in any social context, and findings based on the research will be valid anywhere. So, global here is not just geographical, it's also about universality. And therefore, while I think there are useful things could be pulled out of Collier and Ong, I don't think itself necessarily lends itself to the framework we're looking for to thinking about the impact of globalisation in reshaping places. There is, though, usage of it which developed in a geographical context, particularly Gerd Hollander's work on the global ethanol assemblage. The second approach to investigating globalisation through the analytic of assemblage that has been more influenced by active network theory, and especially the work of Bruno Latour, and it's focused more on the processes of globalisation rather than on any resulting structures or systems. As such, it's been concerned less with globalisation as a noun, but with globalisation as a verb, as indicated earlier. And this perspective not only rejects the binary opposition of the local and the global, but goes further in asserting a flat ontology, that is, without a hierarchical scale, such that the macro is neither above nor below the interactions, but added to them as another of their connections, feeding them and feeding off them. In this view, the local and the global exist on the same plane, scale being produced through connection and extension, as scale is the actor's own achievement, in Latour's words. As such, Latour argues that the global exists only in sites in which it is assembled from components through process of translation, and that the study of the global must start by localising the global back to these sites. Only once this has been done can the global be reassembled by laying, as Latour says, continuous connections leading from one local interaction to the other places, times and agencies through which the local site is made to do something. And whilst Latour is in part interested in the movement of analysts from local specificity to global context, his argument also holds in a more literal geographical sense, as he makes clear examples such as this one here, where he writes that capitalism has no plausible enemy, as it is everywhere, but a given trading room in Wall Street has many competitors. In Shanghai, Frankfurt and London, a computer breakdown a sneaky movement by a competitor, an unexpected figure, a neglected variable in the pricing formula, a risk accounting procedure, that may shift the balance from obscure profit to dramatic loss. Yes, Wall Street is connected to many places, and in this sense, but this sense only, it is bigger, more powerful, more overarching. However, it is not wider, larger, less local, less interactive, and less an intersubjective place than a shopping centre in Moulin, France, or the noisy and smelly market stand in Bouake, Ivory Coast. Don't focus on capitalism. Don't focus on capitalism, but don't stay stuck on the screen of the trading floor either. Follow the connections, follow the actors themselves. And this has been developed further in geographical work, particularly in ideas about urban assemblages, a whole body of work which is emerging here. And within that body of work in urban assemblages, there are a number of examples where there is, again, a direct specific engagement with ideas of globalisation. I'll later Derek McCormack's work about big city marathons as global events, or Slater and Aberystwyth on urban generation, cultural globalisation as seen through the prism of a cultural centre in Asturias, Spain. The final perspective of existing working globalisation from an assemblage approach I want to highlight is that of Tanya Murray Lee, whose work on land and on forest assemblages again adopts this language of assemblage, but draws here a more Foucauldian-informed framework from which she identifies 6 practices she sees as being generic to any assemblage. Forging alignments, which is the work of linking together the objectives of the various parties in assemblage, both those who aspire to govern conduct and those whose conduct is to be conducted. Rendering technical, extracting from the messiness of the social world, while the process that run through it a set of relations that can be formulated in diagram, and which problem plus intervention will in which problem A plus intervention B will produce C, a beneficial result. Authorising knowledge, which is specifying the requisite body of knowledge, confirming enabling assumptions and containing critiques. Fourthly, managing failures and contradictions, presenting failure as the outcome of rectifiable deficiencies, smoothing out contradictions so that it seems superficial rather than fundamental, and devising compromises. Fifthly, anti-politics, reposing political questions as matters of technique, closing down debate about how and what to govern, and the distributive effects of particular arrangements by reference to expertise. And finally, reassembling, grafting on new elements and reworking old ones, deploying existing discourses to new ends, transposing the means of key terms. Now, Lee does not explicitly apply this framework to the analysis of globalisation per se, and she does not use the terminology global assemblages in the same way as Colin and Ongs, but her work on land transactions and land grabbing in particular implicitly engaged with globalisation as a process as it interrogates the assembling of land as a global resource. However, whilst Lee's work provides a mechanism for unpicking the process of assemblage, its Foucauldian emphasis and governmentality captures only part of the dynamics of an assemblage and stands in contrast, I would argue, to the more material and more than human concerns of the Latourian approach. So we have, from this existing body of work, a number of different people who are deploying the terminology of assemblage in ways to try to think about aspects of globalisation. And from each, I think we can potentially draw useful lessons, useful ideas, yet each in their own seem to me limited in how we might apply them to explore the questions we want to explore in relation to the global countryside. By introducing the lander into this mix, however, we argue provides not only a bridge between these two bodies of work, think about assemblages there, think about assemblages now, but also as a third dimension. We're focused on fixing or stabilising assemblages and on the interactions between assemblages. Now, once again, the lander does not explicitly discuss globalisation, perhaps except somewhat obliquely, with reference to the nation-state and assemblage. But it's possible to think about how, or think through his characterisation of the assemblage from which I started, and think out how this relates to the process of globalisation and to emergent global or local assemblages. And therefore, I want to suggest here 4 statements which I think come out of combining De Lander's approach with this wider body of assemblage thinking. The first is that globalisation involves a rearranging of components in assemblages. But it involves adding, detaching, altering material, expressive roles, reconfiguring relations between components, transferring components between assemblages. And we can think of examples here. Branch plans which are sold from one company to another. That's detaching this component from one corporate assemblage and attaching it to another. International land transactions. Commodities traded internationally. Migrants move from one social assemblage to another. In each of these components being taken out into one assemblage and attached into others. The material and expressive roles changing as they go. Secondly, globalisation occurs through the recurrent interaction between assemblages. It aligns or fuses capacities to produce new translocal assemblages with a potentially global reach. And examples here we may think of include corporate mergers, to include new transnational corporations, the coalescence of social movements into global movements, a tendency of trading blocs such as the EU or NAFTA to negotiate agreements which create even more extensive trade areas. Thirdly, globalisation also occurs through the deterritorialisation of assemblages. That new connections made or relations between components are reordered to overspill the boundaries of the existing assemblages. So the company which starts to export, the household which sends a member abroad as a migrant worker, these are acts of deterritorialisation. And they're literal forms of deterritorialisation too, as a detachment from territory, corporate divestment, or the refugee fleeing from home, literally detaching themselves from the territory in which they have been rooted. Fourthly, globalisation proceeds through cycles of coding, decoding and recoding, and this I think does often involve the process outlined in Lee's Foucauldian model suggested earlier, but it also includes linguistic codings of scale. The terms local, regional, national, international are terms, codes which are applied to objects, to components, to assemblages, to try to fix them in scale and space. Decoding occurs then as internal rules of assemblages are transgressed, maybe through acts of deterritorialisation, so tax avoidance by transnational corporations, illegal immigrants who operate outside attempts to code their position within society. And global assemblages develop their own internal codes and rules and give rise to new transnational regulatory assemblages. And then finally, fifthly, globalisation is also fostered by the natural tendency of assemblages towards internal homogeneity. So transnational corporations will standardise supplies, products, processes. McDonald's offering using one variety of potato to produce fries around the world. Tourism operators making the exotic familiar. Supranational organisations adopting and promoting universal standards and values, whether that's about human rights or about the environment, or about animal welfare. And neoliberalism pushing global economic assemblages towards trade liberalisation and the eradication of trade barriers. This tendency towards internal homogeneity. So we can, from assemblage, reduce these number of statements about how globalisation proceeds. Furthermore, I think taking on both the principles articulated in assemblage thinking, we can make 3 further propositions about globalisation. The first is that there's no predominant direction to the exercise of power or agency in globalisation. The global does not impose its will on the local because this division between global and local is constructed, it's artificial. Scale is not a natural hierarchy, but is present in assemblages as reach and magnification. But scale is about reach through assemblages, but equally magnification in the sense that we can open up components within an assemblage which may be treated at one level as a black box. We can take that component out, open it up and show it to be an assemblage itself, which is then comprised of components which for themselves may be opened up as an assemblages. So the territorialisation of a smaller assemblage can impact upon the territorialisation of a larger assemblage of which it is part. Moreover, we can also assert that globalisation is not a linear process. Territorialisation and deterritorialisation, coding and decoding, all occur moving together, things backwards and forwards. It's not a single linear progression. There's no clear line of causality. And rhizomic assemblages reproduce through mimicry and imitation. And think here in terms of globalisation about social movements which spread around the world through imitation, about cultural fashions, about technical mimicry, about the counterfeiting of Jud's word. This is not an arborescent, connected, linear relationship. It's a rhizomic relationship by which things spread through imitation. And thirdly, globalisation is a more than human phenomenon. That global assemblages can only be global because of the incorporation of non-human components that enable them to transcend space, whether that is jet engines or fibre optic cables or satellites or refrigeration technologies. And equally, non-human components arranged in this way are inscribed with meaning through human agency. At the same time, some non-human entities escape from globalisation assemblages to form their own new dissident assemblages, invasive species, pathogens. So add these together and globalisation is a more than human phenomenon. So that brings us to a body of how we might think about globalisation. But how then do we relate that to place? And here we need to step aside for a moment and think about how assemblage thinking has been applied to understanding space and studying space. And to some degree, I always find it surprising that given the prominence afforded to assemblage in human geography in recent years, there's surprisingly little direct geographical analysis of places as assemblages. The urban assemblage work starts to move in this direction, but actually the focus of their objects of inquiry is often not place, the city as a place as such. It is social processes, other assemblages within the city. Some exceptions which stand out in this way, Christopher Parker's work in Oman, work by Chris Rosen and others in Central Otago in New Zealand, and then Colin McFarlane's work on Mumbai and Sao Paulo, which we'll come back to later. But in fact, we can pull out these exceptions, show actually how limited I think this analysis has been. And this is perhaps even more surprising given the fact that De Lander, in his work in a new theory of society, a new philosophy of society, does quite explicitly discuss neighbourhoods and cities and nations as being assemblages. And it's worth pulling some of this out. Certainly he sees assemblages which are comprised by material components such as buildings, public spaces, infrastructure. Highlighted here again some of the infrastructure underlying the city. But those components also have expressive components. So place is to some degree defined, given identity, through expressive components, including building facades, including iconic skylines. He talks here, this is talking about the historical development of the city. On the expressive side, he says, it is exterior buildings, that is the decoration or lack of it on their facades, that define the personality of a neighbourhood. In residential neighbourhoods where streets were narrow and the layout found a complex maze, the frontage of the houses remained rather plain. Hence, expressive interiors appeared first in public buildings. They are typically located in a central square in which the surrounding space opens up vistas, that is, the opportunities for unusual visual experiences, an effect enhanced by straight streets leading to the church, the administrative building, the monument. Here we have these monuments, the churches, the public buildings, as components in a neighbourhood as an assemblage, performing a material role as a place of worship, as a place of governance, but also here performing an expressive role in providing a sense of identity to that neighbourhood, in conveying meaning about that neighbourhood. De Lander goes on and talks about the territorialisation processes of the city as an assemblage, and this being linked to processes of congregation and segregation in a social mixing of population. but equally deterritorialisation occurring through processes such as outmigration and innovations in urban transportation. He argues here that a good example of destabilising effects of increased mobility afforded by mechanical transportation are the changes that working class neighbourhoods underwent towards the end of the 19th century. These neighbourhoods had sharply defined borders when the journeys to work was on foot, but as the electric trolley became available, the need to live close to the factory was removed, and the new working class suburbs with more porous boundaries emerged. And as a consequence of this interaction, this is a deterritorialisation of the city as an assemblage. Its spatial footprint changed as a consequence. So from Nederlander we start to get some sense of thinking of analysing places as assemblages. Nederlander provides a useful, if sometimes crude and generally historically evidenced, demonstration of how assemblage analysis can be applied to places. But further sites can also be drawn upon from other assemblage theorists. In this vein, Colin McFarlane, for example, builds not only on Deleuze and Nederlander, but also on Latour and Long, and makes connection with dwelling theory to construct a conceptualisation of assemblage for urban analysis. This, he explains, departs from three main starting points, which I've highlighted here. Firstly, that assemblage is an attempt to emphasise that urban processes are more than just reactions, between sites and actors. Assemblage thinking, he says, emphasises the depth and potentiality of sites and actors in terms of their histories, the labour required to produce them, and their inevitable capacity to exceed the sum of their connections. Now, this observation not only situates the present place assemblage in its historical context, but also emphasises that its form is contingent, that an alternative city is just one step away. As such, McFarlane argues, assemblage draws attention less to the ecology relations and more to the particular urban alignments formed through processes of gathering, dispersion and change. At particular moments for certain durations, differential exteriorities can enter into the constitution of assemblages, only to change or disperse at a different time or from particular angles of vision. Then secondly, urban assemblages are not simply a spatial category input or resultant formation, but signify doing, performance and events. This stress on performativity reinforces the notion of cities as being constantly in a state of becoming, as multiple assemblages of actual and virtual urbanisms located in emergent material practice and which are not characterised by any pre-given spatial or temporal templates. And then thirdly, as a concept, the urban assemblage is structured, hierarchised and narrativized through profoundly unequal relations of power, resource and knowledge. Rather than a kind of crude opposition to structural hierarchy, the spatialis and temporalis of urban assemblages can be captured, structured and stored more efficiently and with greater influence by particular actors and processes than by others. And this point is critical for returning to the questions of power and agency in globalisation that we raised that lie at the heart of our research. There is danger that an emphasis on distributed agency in assemblage theory, and particularly in its tutorial formulation, may be taken to apply an evenness of power. Yet, as McFarlane asserts, different actors have different capacities to shape assemblages, and moreover, urban assemblages can be rolled in exercise of power with different configurations of assemblages having social and political effects. As he says, certain forms of urbanism have the power to destroy, reduce and enable particular forms of urban life. So, I'm going to move on to I'll try to summarise that previous work to try to drive this further now in terms of application. Because out of all these different perspectives, we end up here positing a number of statements about place and globalisation, how this works. And firstly, we argue that globalisation impacts on places through the interactions between place assemblages and translocal, social, economic, cultural, political and technological assemblages. We argue that place and translocal assemblages share components, but with different roles performed by those components in the different assemblages. Indeed, the relations of a so we take, for example, a factory. A factory is maybe located in a corporate assemblage as a site of production, as a site of capital accumulation, is at the same time located within a place assemblage, which performs a role as a site of employment, a creation of employment, and may also perform an expressive role in giving identity to that local economy, to that locality. The relations of a component in a translocal assemblage may change, or affecting the material expressive role of that entity in the place assemblage. So if that factory shifts in producing goods for a new market, or is taken over by a different corporation, it doesn't necessarily affect the roles it plays within the place assemblage. But we can also find processes of re-territorialisation of a translocal assemblage that do impact on the material role of a component in a place assemblage. That factory being closed, the opening of new factories through foreign direct investment, the arrival of new migrants in a city, those actually then also change the place assemblage. And furthermore, we can find examples where entities may lose a material role in a place assemblage due to the re-territorialisation of translocal assemblages, but retain an expressive role. The example I give here is of the dockyards in Belfast, and these cranes, Samson and Goliath, which still stand there. There's no longer shipbuilding here. These cranes no longer perform the material role. They did either in the shipbuilding assemblage or indeed in Belfast Place assemblage when they helped to provide a material role of employment. But they still continue to provide and to perform an expressive role in terms of the identity of place. Secondly, effects in translocal and place assemblages are linked by developments in assemblages of connectivity that provide conduits between places. And these can have enabling and constraining effects. Lander gives the example of the development of suburban railways. The technology required a certain distance for steam locomotives to accelerate and decelerate between stops, and that provided a regularity, a metric of where they could stop along the railway line, the distance at which stations could be located, and therefore to create a territorialisation of suburbs. We might think in a contemporary context of globalisation about how budget air travel has enabled the expansion of international tourism, transformed the destinations to which they're now linking, denuded the traditional resorts where people used to go on holiday but no longer do so. And yet their territorialisation is also constrained by the location of airports, by the landing fees charged, by the distance ranges of the aircraft being used and so on. Thirdly, patterns of deterritorialisation and re-territorialisation in translocal assemblages prompt patterns of deterritorialisation and re-territorialisation in place assemblages. So foreign direct investment and divestment, booms in international tourism, the in and out migration are all deterritorialising pressures on place assemblages as they dilute internal homogeneity and or transgress spatial boundaries. And in order to respond to these changes, new forms of territorialisation and connectivity may be introduced at local scale, which may be spatial or organisational, the building of new roads or rail systems that link into edge of city developments, housing estates, industrial developments, or language classes in order to provide the connectivity into new migrant communities. Fourthly, globalisation can prompt processes of decoding and recoding in place assemblages as meanings are renegotiated and rules no longer hold effectively. And therefore we can see this as changes in formal codes, for example in land use planning systems responding to changes, or changes in informal rules of everyday social interaction, the language which is used in everyday life, customs and cultural practices. Or it can become from recoding from incorporation into translocal assemblages, and a tendency that exists towards internal homogeneity within those translocal assemblages. So, for example, new rules are imposed for areas that get designated as national parks and nature reserves according to international models and agreements. So, from all of this, we work through from thinking about the initial principles of assemblages through to articulating a number of statements, possibilities about how we think globalisation impacts from places and changes places and how that globalisation is reproduced for those places. But in following this vein, highlighting contingency, heterogeneity, and distributed agency, we get to a position where the state seems to disappear from view. And first of all, I want to move to the final part of this talk by thinking about where does the state fit into this. And to some degree, this reflects what I want to regard here as the rather strange invisibility of the state in much assemblage thinking. There is, for example, little mention of the state in work on urban assemblages or on global assemblages, certainly not the state as an object of analysis. The state is present, obviously, in work on policy assemblages, but tended to be treated there as a site in which policy assemblages are produced and reproduced, rather than again as an assemblage in its own right, or as something as an object of analysis somewhere. And Delander himself, in trying to develop and articulate a materialist ontology, rather dismisses the state. He says here that other verified generalities like the state should also be replaced. In addition to communities, a set of interacting persons can give rise to institutional organisation possessing emergent properties like legitimacy. Organisation in turn can give interact to form a larger whole like a federal government. But that's it, the state, he sees terms of organisation as being more useful than the state. So I've already argued that both the market and the state can be eliminated from materialist ontology by a nested set of individual emergent wholes operating at different scales. And yet, he also notes the apparent incompatibility of this assertion, this removal of the state, with the frequent references to the state of Deleuze-Guattari's work on which Delander is developing his materialist ontology. So, to think perhaps about where the state fits into this, we need to go back to Deleuze-Guattari. Now, I haven't time here for a full meditation on the role of the state in Deleuze-Guattari, so I want to just draw up, I think, three or four key points from this. Firstly, it struck me that Deleuze-Guattari talk about, to discuss the evolution of the modern state in the context of the realisation of global capital. I think this is interesting again, thinking about state and globalisation from an established point of view. A couple of examples here, they say what is called the nation state, the most diverse of forms, is precisely the state as a model of realisation. In principle, all states are isomorphic. In other words, they are the means of realisation of capital as a function of a sole external world market. And therefore, it's interesting to step back from saying, see, again, in thinking about globalisation, about states, if we see states as realisations of capital, the states are not suppressed by global capital, but indeed become necessary to the globalisation of capitalism. And these connections is one of these places where I think we can potentially open the door to draw on more political economic theory in terms of thinking about that relationship. Secondly, the state is a striation machine in that it divides and rules. Bodden Protivi and their book in the Deleuze and Geophilosophy state that the state is an abstract machine of order coding, of stratification. And Deleuze-Guattari write that not only does the state exercise power over the segments it sustains or permits to survive, but it possesses and opposes its own segmentarity. That one of the fundamental tasks of the state is to striate the space over which it reigns, or to utilise smooth spaces as a means of communication in the service of striated space. And thus we see that states striate global smooth space into nation states. That states striate their internal territory into a political geography of administration. That states trait or segment society into different categories and classes. And furthermore, as I've argued in a previous paper in Society and Space on rhizomic and arborescent social movements, state territorialisation follows an arborescent structure that others are compelled to imitate, a hierarchical structure based on the model of the tree, of trunks and branches and linearity. And indeed, they suggest this arborescent model which helps to hold things together is the heart of territorialisation, if you like, in an assemblage sense. That if we ask the general question, what holds things together, the clearest, easiest answer seems to be provided by the formalising, linear, hierarchalised, centralised, arborescent model. Yet thirdly, the state can also act as a smoothing machine. It striates space, but it can also smooth space. But in striating space and segmented society, the state also creates smooth spaces within those striations in which social and economic interactions take place. And we can think of examples of this. We can mark it as being smooth spaces, as social policy, as the creation of smooth spaces to help a harmonious society, as communications infrastructure, as smooth spaces through which connections can be made, or the smoothing of the body to make it governable. But equally, these two terms, these two processes never be separational. That smoothing then necessarily implies striation, as William Beauregard writes. And then fourthly, to derive from Deleuze-Guattari here, the state is a coding machine. That nation states, as they clearly assert, are the overcoding of global space. And that the states furthermore code people, places, commodities, practices and values and so on. Law is a coding device which creates the codes through which we interact with each other, through which we operate. And that coding and decoding and recoding are all essential technologies to the practice of governance, and we can here see connections to ideas of governmentality. As Bontempi again say, the state is an apparatus or complex mechanism whereby alien or rogue semiotics and machine assemblages are captured and overcoded, engulfed by transcendent thought that straits all reality, space, time, body, culture, nature. Thus, from taking again these kind of insights from Deleuze-Guattari, we then come to the position of thinking from an assemblage point of view about how the state may interact with globalisation. Here, we see that the state as a smooth machine facilitates globalisation by creating smooth spaces for the movement and exchange of capital, commodities and people. Think here about free trade areas agreements and transnational single markets. I'll think about visa-free travel areas and arrangements. I'll think about international treaty obligations. At the same time, however, these acts of smoothing are also acts of striation. Those new transnational smooth spaces also have hard boundaries, the external border of the European Union to trade, to migration. And Deleuze-Guattari indeed argue that I suggest that the construction of the globe itself is an act of striation by establishing planetary boundaries. Furthermore, the state's coding and striation of its internal territory and subjects conditions interactions between places and subjects with global or transnational assemblages. Their internal lines of striation, both spatial and social, inhibit the mobility of objects. For example, employment restrictions on migrants, market regulation in terms of what can be sold by security zones. There's also coding of entities that restrict or condition their exchange between assemblages, laws on the foreign ownership of land or corporations, tariffs being imposed on commodities. At the same time, the neoliberal state is engaged in internal smoothing and recoding in the interest of capital, trying to remove some of these regulations, creating these smooth spaces in order to facilitate capital accumulation. Furthermore, the state is engaged in an ongoing struggle with rhizomic lines of flight that seek to evade its coding and segmentarity. That migration and trade across national borders tend to complicate the effort to create a single national territory, single national identity, and to this extent it may be considered deterritorialisation as the lambda. But think also about offshoring of economic activity, divestment of capital, migration flows, global circulation of cultural ideas and practices, imitation of cultural artefacts, transnational terrorism and trying global social movements, the more than human globalisations of pests and pathogens. All of these are rhizomic lines of flight with which the state in its arborescent form seeks to struggle. And thus the state is constantly engaged in recoding and reterritorialisation in response to these globalisation lines of flight. And perhaps it's through these struggles that actually the state persists in globalisation, as Bontempi put it, the nation-state system that overcodes the planet, such that it is not only impossible to carve out a non-state anywhere, but also all attempts to achieve independence from existing nation-states result in the establishment of yet more nation-states. Regardless of the proliferation of non-state actors and even globalisation, the state is still the only conceivable way in which the earth can be organised by humans. So even when we think about an assemblage approach to globalisation of place, we cannot exclude the state. The state is still there in its form. And therefore I want just to finish by briefly talking about two case studies which begin to highlight these. These come from range of case studies which we're looking at as part of the Global Rural Project. And I want to talk about economic restructuring in Queensland, in Australia, and about immigration in the Western Islands. So, briefly, let's start turn first to Australia. And I'm interested here in the closure of this factory, the Moreton Sugar Mill, in a small town of Nambo in Queensland in 2003. The closure of this plant, as is often the case with closure of industrial units, was attributed to the global economic change. With poor harvest, falling world prices, growing competition in Brazil, the owners of the mill at Nambo said the Sunshine Coast operation is no longer viable. So some of the research we did here was trying to think about, well, is that the case? How is that the case? What are the connections between global change and the closure of this mill? And trying to use assemblage as a way of making those connections. Again, not got the time to go into this in detail. We have got a longer presentation on this, which is on our website if you're interested, and the paper which is under review. But just to very briefly sketch out the nature of this argument. So we start by talking about how actually the fate of this mill can be tied back to the reterritorialisation of the global sugar assemblage. There's a deterritorialisation of historic trade agreements, such as the supply agreement of Australian sugar to the United Kingdom. At the same time, there's an emergence of new markets, particularly in Asia. There's additional input into this assemblage from increased production in Brazil and in new countries like Thailand. But a consequence that we get by the 1990s, a situation of oversupply in the global market emerging for sugar, which has the consequence of recoding the value attributed to sugar in world markets and pressing down the world sugar price. That in turn puts pressure on the Australian sugar assemblage, which is characterised by rigid organisational and spatial territorialisation. There is in effect a monopoly purchasing system with one single desk buyer of raw sugar for export to which mills supply. And moreover, there's a system by which the cane mills, which are triangles down here, each have particular areas of land assigned to them, and they take cane only from that land, and that land can supply only that mill. What that means is that there's little scope for increased efficiency, for reducing competitiveness through internal competition within the assemblage. The competitive advantage of the Australian sugar industry comes from research and development, yet even though that's compromised by this mobility of components, that the new technologies can be attached from that Australian component and copied elsewhere in Brazil or elsewhere. And this leads in turn to a predominant discourse by the end of the 1990s that adjustment to globalisation required increased production in the sugar industry. This filters down in turn to create a challenge for the Moreton mill assemblage, the assemblage around this particular mill. The land doesn't come across this well on this slide, but the assigned land, which is very closely mapped on here, they come in, the cane railway which brings it all into the mill. And at this time there's a consensus view that the viability of the mill into the future depended on increasing production. The rigidity of the system didn't allow any other way of increasing the profitability of the mill. The only way to do so was to increase the production of the mill, the flow of sugar coming into the mill. But that required expanding the assigned land. And the problem here is that this is located on the Sunshine Coast of Queensland. This is the fastest urbanising part of Australia, and therefore the sugar assemblage was competing for land with a tourism assemblage, with an urbanisation assemblage, which were seeking to detach land from that sugar assemblage, convert it, attach it to these alternative assemblages. The consequence was that the mill struggled to achieve profitability, and therefore its coding within the corporate assemblages of its owners changed. And that's changed furthermore as it was itself bought and sold between different corporations, taken into one corporate assemblage, plugged into another, in which internal relations are different, and in which its coding was different. So whilst Tate and Lyle may have actually tolerated a lack of profits, the new owners in 2000, Finisuka, required it to become profitable, and when it failed to do so, closed it down in December 2003. After that, there were a number of attempts to take the individual components and reassemble them in new ways to access new markets. Each of these failed because of the failure to assemble these components in a way which worked, and because of the way it impacted in the way that some of the components were being coded. So where does the state fit into this? Well, the state has been an actor here in the reterritorialisation of the global and national sugar assemblages. It was state-led smoothing and striation of trade spaces that forced reterritorialisation, such as cutting Australia out of sugar supply to Britain. Brazilian restructuring of its internal sugar markets created a smooth space that put more sugar into international markets. And the Australian neoliberal assemblage smooth machine, promoting food chains and deregulating the Australian market. At the same time, we see limits of state power. Australian state strategy being based on erroneous coding of projected world sugar price. The privatisation and deregulation of Australian sugar industry being only partially successful in deterritorialisation, because this rigid territorialisation is also constrained by the materiality of the sugar crop, which needs to be processed within 16 hours of harvesting, and therefore limited distances by which it could be transported. And that the fact that code and striate placed in Texas plainland also failed because of the ability to actually create enough attraction to stop it being captured into competing assemblages. I'll quickly take camera at a time. I'm just going to tell it very, very briefly on the second case study of immigration in rural Ireland. And here looking at two small towns which have significant migrant populations. Galt here, population of 2,600. 2 years ago, 40% of its population were Brazilians. And the town of Ballyhonus, population of 2,300 people, including 43 different nationalities, with half the population born outside Ireland. We're looking at these. And what we have here, again, thinking about these changes from an assemblage point of view, we see international migration as a form of deterritorialisation. Migration involving the assembling of different components connected to facilitate movement across space. And migrants, once they get there, being enrolled as components in place assemblages with material roles such as source of labour, but also migrants also able to introduce additional components into place assemblages, which have both material and expressive roles. So in Ballyhonus, for example, we see the construction of a mosque, the introduction of halal shops, a cricket club, Polish shops, Polish language schools, books in different languages in the local school. In Gort, we see Brazilian food shops with hairdressers, money transfer offices, Pentecostal churches, bilingual signage, Brazilian flags being displayed during the Soccer World Cup. These are new components into the place assemblage introduced by the immigrant populations. Furthermore, the migrants contribute to the reterritorialisation of these place assemblages, to the reconfiguration of social relations, networks and structures, the new geographies with new residential patterns, because even in these small towns, the migrant populations tend to cluster together. But there's also new spaces of integration, places like schools and sports clubs, as well as spaces of segregation, the churches that only service the migrant population, or the pubs and clubs which actually remain out of bounds in many of the private populations, as well as new hybrid spaces and artefacts. And migrants too contribute to the recoding of place assemblages and their components, changing the meaning of place identity. Got recast as being Rio on Shannon because of its Brazilian population. New different codes of social interaction coming in. New religious codes, influenced, for example, by the Muslim population. The language of everyday life which is used changing. And here again we can step back and think about the role of the state. But immigration here is only facilitated by the state as a smooth machine in creating these conduits for migration to move. But once here the state differentially codes migrants, EU, non-EU, legal, illegal, the coding of asylum seekers and refugees. That differential coding striates the migrants' bodies and the spatial and social mobility in terms of access to employment, education, the ability to participate in community life, and so on. That's particularly seen in the case of asylum seekers, because I forgot to say that Ballyhonus, with its 43 different nationalities, has 3 different ways of migration. It has workers from Pakistan and Syria who were recruited to work in a halal meat factory in the early 1970s and subsequently grew as a community. It has Polish and Lithuanian and Eastern European migrants who arrived in the mid-2000s, and it also has the residents of a asylum processing centre, about 200 residents at a time, plus those who come through the system and decide to settle in return. So we have this asylum processing centre in Ballyhonus, about 200 residents at a time, and here we can see examples of the migrants who are here in the centre are verbally close in a sense. They've been captured into an arborescent assemblage estate from rhizomic line to flight, which are the escape from home countries. But the coding of these residents as asylum seekers then impacts upon their spatial mobility, which is striated by the compelled residents in this centre. But their exclusion from the labour market differentiates these asylum seekers from the other immigrants in the town. And that spatial participation is constrained by the financial striation of their finances, being allowed only a 12-euro weekly allowance, and by temporal uncertainty, in that they don't know how long it will take for the application to be processed. They could be there 6 years, or they could be moved out the following week, and that makes it difficult to participate in community life. All of these can be seen part of the coding striation of their lives by the state. At the same time, there are lines of flight for state code and territorialisation. They're seen perhaps most evidently in gold with the breaching of visa conditions by Brazilian migrants who participate in the informal economy, either because jobs have disappeared in the formal economy in the recession, or because they can earn more in the informal economy, those who overstayed elite visas, as well as by others who deviate from the script of integration through non-participation in integration activities, through the assertion of cultural codings which come in tension with the cultural codings of the Irish state, for example, the wearing of headscarves by Muslim girls in schools. And then finally we see also that this remaking of these places, these two towns through globalisation and migration, is itself shaped by the re-territorialisation of the Irish state assemblages under conditions of austerity, cuts for funding for integration initiatives and additional support for schools, which can be seen as a de-territorialisation of certain components from these integration assemblages, or the spatial reorganisation of the police and immigration services. That re-territorialisation which removed a dedicated immigration officer from Gore Police Station to a different town 25 kilometres away had an effect both in terms of the migrants that town being able to access that service, but also in terms of the attitude adopted then by the responsible officer, who became much more intolerant of undocumented and illegal immigrants within the town, a change of atmosphere. So finally, just to conclude, that what we try to show here is that assemblage thinking highlights the micropolitics of globalisation, emphasising contingency, heterogeneity and contestation. That globalisation involves processes of reassembling, for which interactions of global, national and local assemblages, as nouns here, that places are reconstituting globalisation, therefore, through the interaction with translocal assemblages, the introduction of withdrawal of components, and process of re-territorialisation and recoding. Distributed agency, as identified through this perspective, therefore points to the involvement of multiple actors, including the state. And we can see this role of state, of how the state both facilitates and responds to globalisation, and that the arborescent territorialisation and coding practices of state continue to circumscribe the conditions of interaction between place assemblages and translocal assemblages, whether that's assemblages of corporations and economic performance, assemblages of migration, and so on. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Michael, for that talk. Given that the event is called Disassembling State Spaces, Conceptualising New Geometries of Power, it's hard to imagine a more appropriate plenary lecture. So, I think there's a bit of time for Q&A, discussion. Over to you. Who'd like to begin, please?
I have one question. You did refer to the non-citizen earlier on, and I'm wondering, and you talked about distributed agency.
Yeah.
Jane Bennett talks about the migrant materials.
Yeah.
Could you address a little bit more how you're thinking about the non-human within this rural project?
Yes, I mean, there's two ways I think we want to do it. One is, in line with Jane Bennett's work, for example, which again another assemblage writer we've not mentioned here, is thinking about technologies. And I think that I hinted in one of the bullet points about the the role of certain technologies in enabling the expansion of these of assemblages of space by reterritorialisation up to a global scale. Some of the other work one of the other cases I'm doing is looking at the dairying industry in Australia and New Zealand. They're changing, and actually you can say there about, you look historically, then refrigeration of course allowed that initial set of changes. You've got a shift now into supplying milk powder into China, for example, and there are particular technologies which were invested in order to achieve that. There's a need actually to get a ship to actually physically transport this from New Zealand to China. That had to be enrolled as well. That market's now changing. There's an increasing market for liquid milking in China. New Zealand's actually starting to lose out of this to Australia, and that's expanding partly because there's new technologies coming on board which will actually prolong the life or the freshness of clean milk. So we're looking at some of these technological innovations which are facilitating, if you like, some of these reterritorializations of the networks reverse. So that's one way of looking at it. The other is looking at the if you like, the moment of human globalization of plants and animals, and we're interested here to say about the again the way in which some of those things were deliberately transported and moved in order to create new assemblages, particularly in agriculture, but also to remake, kind of change landscapes to make them more familiar European. So that's about the expressive components of those plants and animals, expressive components and what they symbolise in the landscape, but also where they become lines of flight that escape those human movements. So you then have the invasive species, which are introduced by mistake or actually take on a different role, interact with the new within the new environment in ways which are unanticipated. It's about pests being spread, it's about pathogens being spread, and the way in which then that requires certain actions of biosecurity, a new striation of space through biosecurity regulations, which is most aggressively being applied by some of the most neoliberal governments when it comes to actually removing economic barriers. There's a form of protectionism being reinvented through biosecurity regulations, a new striation of space. So much of that detail of that research is still to come in the project, but those are the lines we're thinking on.
Cheers. Thanks for that. There was so much stuff.
Yeah, sorry.
But yeah, thanks for that. I've been interested for a while in this new materialist literature. I must say I'm really ignorant, so what follows, I'm not really sure if it's asking for clarification, if it's a disagreement, or because I'm not sure if I have to fully grasp it. But the concept of assemblage, I'm someone that tries to work with history and agency. So the concept of assemblage at first sounds to me strikes me something very interesting to highlight, like you're saying, tension and contingency, as opposed to perhaps other terms that have a more deterministic bent, like structure, just for instance. But there was something that, so I was like sold on that. I was like, okay, fine, I like this. But then in your exposition of the literature, you started talking about properties intrinsic to the process of assemblage. And that's where I thought that perhaps there was a bit of a slippage happening. Yeah. Because there was I think it was point 5, just to give you an example, you were speaking of a natural tendency towards homogenization of its constituting units. Natural tendency. And then I was thinking that perhaps we have to slip into structuralism again. Because the examples you gave were like, the tendency of transnational organizations to speak of human rights, the economies of scale in transnational corporations, the standardization of organization methods. And I was wondering that these things did not come about in history just because of the assemblages that were making them up. They have a history, it's separate to just the fact they were, like there's nothing intrinsic in capitalist accumulation that would have to lead to economies of scale, perhaps, or that human rights would become like a transnational norm. So I was just wondering if if there's tension there, or if you have some reflections on that. I mean, I'm not.
No, I entirely take your point, and as you're saying this, I do recall that in a previous version of this talk, I picked up on the use of that word natural, and I intended to take it out because I think it's not the right word to use there. I don't really mean this as natural, but I think there is. So that's the first point to make. I think the second one is this again is something I want to probe further and haven't done yet, is that DeLanda makes this assertion that assemblages have a tendency towards internal homogeneity. I think that's actually quite a useful point in thinking about globalisation, because it does seem to be that that one of the things that's happening is that you have got translocal assemblages, and there is then homogenisation, a tendency towards homogeneity within them, and that's part of what we see observing. So there is, in a sense, an observation which tends to support that proposition. What I am less clear on, and I haven't yet gone back to try to trace it backwards, is the basis on which DeLanda is making that assertion. Because I'm not clear. I don't think it does. To me, it doesn't seem to naturally. I'm not even naturally again. It doesn't seem to follow in an obvious way from some of the other extrapolations from the losing guitar which he uses. So, where that particular assertion comes from, I'm not 100% certain, and it's something I need to follow up further. But there is a certain degree of correspondence between that as a proposition and some of the empirical observation. But again, then you get to say, well, this isn't because I say it goes back to the sense of saying, well, I'm not sure this isn't a theory of explanation, because I don't think we can say, well, actually, assemblages move towards internal homogeneity, and that explains why we see this happening, we see this cultural homogenisation in these places and so on. That's not an explanatory relationship, so that does certainly need probing further.
Okay, I think there are a couple of questions. Firstly, David, I think, had his hand up first.
Well, thanks for that talk. I just got a question, perhaps born out of the same ignorance in a way. I was just wondering in what sense an assemblage gets titled the way you did it, and in a sense, just taking up the Queensland example, in a way that was just the classical scaling. I mean, it was a global scale, it was a regional scale, and it was a very localized scale. And in what sense you'd observe an overlapping of different assemblages, having like the place assemblage of the factory in its interaction with other places. The workers were completely absent from that. Do the workers in their own materiality possess their own assemblage properties, right? Just where is the boundary of the assemblage, and how does it, in its constant shifting, actually get determined as being a sugar assemblage?
Absolutely. No, I think that's a very important point. And I think, again, I think one of the critiques we can throw at assemblage thinking is the problem with the overuse of the term assemblage. You end up using assemblage to describe everything, and that at the very least becomes very confusing. I think in terms of thinking about boundaries of assemblages and things, I think this is where I see an advantage of assemblage in the way described by DeLanda there over, for example, terms such as actor network, because I think one of the things that the attention to territorialisation and coding that DeLanda highlights is thinking about how boundaries are established for assemblages. So territorialisation in giving it a shape, to me, also implies a sense of thinking about where are the boundaries to what shape do they have, where are the boundaries to this territorialisation. Coding and talking about identity, I think, can do the same. And this is what I think what happens when you talk in that the case of the sugar assemblages, where again there's inevitably some kind of simplification for description going on here. But I think what you do get is, in an industry like that, scales coming into being because they're being discursively constructed in certain ways and reinforced through agreements. So when we talk about a national sugar assemblage there, well, that is a national industry that is actually subject to a set of regulations from the Australian state, is being described and bounded in that way. The global assemblage, well, shall we say global or transnational, is something which exceeds that, and is clearly then about these different kind of national components interacting. So some of that scaling is about actually a shorthand for describing, thinking through some of these, the interactions between different components and opening up components within larger assemblages to think about how this operates and so on. What you have in an example like that, though, you'd be quite right to say, is all kind of other overlapping assemblages and components in places. So we talk about, we describe this here as being a sugar assemblage, but it also links into the biofuel assemblage. These things are also part of corporate assemblages, they're part of commodity chains which actually are part of a food chain. There are labour markets, there are technological components. Actually, these components can be taken out, and so these all exist as part of multiple assemblages, and you could describe these in different ways. What I want to suggest in that example is that in trying to explain why this particular mill closed at that particular time, then the changes within and the interaction between these particular assemblages within the sugar industry are the ones that provide that explanation. I might actually want to look at those same components as part of different assemblages configured in different ways to actually understand something else.
Did you want to come back?
No, not really. Think about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know what you mean.
Francesca, hi. Thanks for your talk. I think I'm going to just...
Sorry, I think there might have been a misunderstanding. I thought that the message was that your question had already been asked. Is that?
No,
Oh, right.
that's very close to that.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I misunderstood.
All right.
So can we allow?
Please go ahead.
And then
Yeah.
I'll come back to you. Sorry.
So, okay. Just following from the two previous questions, I thought the same kind of slippage. So if we are using assemblage as a term to describe maybe an ever-changing dynamic structure, so why don't we use ever-changing dynamic structure? Because assemblage comes with a theoretical bug that we need necessarily to deal with if we want to use it. And I come also from my own struggle. I'm part of a project that bears assemblage as a title. So I'm struggling on how to use this term. And I'm thinking, I think that the term assemblage maybe it's really helpful when it's very contingent, as Abby was saying. And throughout, since Deleuze and Guattari, there has always been a sort of struggle to generalize a little bit. Like everybody's talking about assemblage, and somehow like abstracting it from the empirical roots that it's where the power of this term lies. So I was thinking if we can come back a little bit about that. And one very small question is like assemblage has also had a very strong grip on science and technology studies. Maybe you were mentioning that too, which comes from the 70s when science was coming through this kind of shift, like what is science and what is reality. So I was wondering how you place yourself in this kind of movement.
Yes, and I think you're right. I mean, again, you're once again highlighting these issues and problems with the use of this term and positioning it. And actually, as I started here, and this is, in a sense, why we've been thinking through this paper and what we're trying to do in this paper. And as I said at the very beginning, it's by no means a completed thought process, because I think we're still wrestling with a lot of the issues you're raising, was precise to think, well, from what we understand of assemblage thinking, this seems to capture the way in which we want to think about globalization in place here. But once you start using those terms, you start then linking into these various contexts, the baggage which is there. We need to think about how we're using it and what we're bringing out of it. So that's partly what we're actually just trying to do through the paper. And therefore, for example, yes, you then start connecting into that. There is that history of use of the word assemblage within science technology studies, or that comes through interactive network theory and into the work of Latour and Cullen and others. And I see there's things I can take from that work. I think lots of the focus on some of these very small scale microprocesses, things which are in there about the nature of power and of agency, and actually how that needs to be constructed through bringing things together through an assemblage, I think are useful to do this. But I also struggle with I think the continuous ephemerality and contingency of those things. Like these are only brought together, and where I think thinking about things like territorialization and coding comes in useful. It's helping to provide a degree of understanding of how stable or how such assemblages are stabilised over a period of time, which then gives them again a form of power or a form of significance. So that's where we're trying to wrestle with some of those things. And yeah, when you say abstracting, you take concept, abstract it from the empirical setting that can give it more power, but at the same time I want to see the usefulness of these terms and understanding the empirical reality out there, which does easily bringing back to an empirical context. And it's when you start bringing some of these ideas back down into an empirical context, you start seeing the inadequacies or the problematics which are involved.
Okay. Apologies for the confusion.
Yeah, don't worry.
I was struck by the way you brought the state back in. And the way you describe the state as doing the divided rules, created spaces, the smoothing machine, the coding machine of people, places, and commodities. Okay. The thing is, I can think of territorially bounded entities, or assemblages, if I'm using the word correctly, doing these things since immemorial times. Then what is particular about the state as an entity does that? And even pushing further, what is particular about the neoliberal state, which is this adjective neoliberal that you brought that in, right? What difference does it make?
I think yes. Does the state have a monopoly over the striation of space, etc.? No, it doesn't. I think some of the power of the nation state stands comes through from this argument in terms of its overcoding of space, which codes space into territories which are being assigned to understood as nation states. It's then about the degree to which there is a monopoly of violence, a monopoly of other coercive powers within those spaces, which upholds that state as a primary actor. Compare states and corporations which act in various ways. I think there is something about the legal resources, the idea of sovereignty, which gets attached to the state in its ability to striate and to enforce that territorialization, to then deploy, for example, restrictions about the movement of goods, the movement of people across that territorial unit, which exceeds, I would argue, the power of other assemblages to do that in many ways. I'm thinking off the top of my head of some of these things here, but I think there are arguments we can make that the state does behave in certain ways in order to do that. I think the arguments I would make in the neoliberal state are then in relation to, I think if we see the state of historically having a movement or an interest in the striation and segmentation of space, one can make arguments about how a neoliberal state is acting in a smoothing space in order to facilitate the flow of capital and the accumulation of capital. So that involves promotion of free trade, removing some of those striations which were then structuring economies and markets and removing those. That involves the smoothing over of striations between the public and the private sector. That involves internal markets. That involves, I think, a smoothing of economic space which supports certain forms of accumulation. And I think that that is where I see a neoliberal state behaving in certain particular ways.
Okay, I've been given my orders from one of the conference organisers to move towards a conclusion. That is not to conclude immediately, I'm interpreting. So, I think Stuart and Antonio, if I can take your questions together, and then I think we're going to have to draw a line. Stuart.
Michael, I'm kind of sorry to ask this question because it was in your paper, but you didn't say very much about it, and I suspect it's also a question you get rather involved. But it's about the rural.
Yes.
It's about how you're trying to conceptualise the rural, and particularly how you're trying to conceptualise the rural in relation to the urban, and maybe to kind of focus it a little bit because that's such a huge question. People like Neil Brenner, Christian Schmidt, and so on are trying to think about the urban without the outside, the urban theory itself, and the premise of, i.e. the non-urban, which is often the rural. And the way they're trying to think about extended urbanisation will encompass a number of things that you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wondered kind of whether you could give some sort of sense about how you're still trying to keep place for what you want to think about as the rural when it's so difficult to draw a line between the rural
absolutely.
What is
Well, my questions. Well, first of all, thank you so much because that was really interesting, and I think it really got to one of the things we're trying to do with these 2 days, which was bringing about languages for other ways of relating to geometries of power that are not strictly those that we're used to in that polygonic world map of state territory. So I think the talk delivered really well on that. Then, in relation to the conversation that was rising, into the question about whether this reflection on assemblages only provides a general descriptive language, which might be useful as a general descriptive language, or whether it says something rather, or whether it's useful for something rather more specific. I found the word capital there in the presentation circulating as perhaps something that has to do with some kind of specificity that you're trying to draw out. So,
I much prefer Stuart's question. I think the capital there, I mean, no, I think you're right. One of the things, honestly, let me preface this just of all, so I again kind of say thank you for these comments. I think this is, as I said at the beginning, this is very much something, an ongoing process of thinking through these ideas, of trying to wrestle with some of these concepts and come back on that. So we've tried running at least bits of this talk a couple of times, and every time you get feedback you take it back and think further through it, and lots of the things you're highlighting are things we're still thinking about. One of the things which still eludes me a little, and I still try to think through, is the role of capital in terms of assemblages. And I am not yet sure what capital is in relation to assemblage. I'm not sure, is capital a component in there, is it something else? And that's and I think what you're saying offers something, but maybe that is something which can drive some stress in. But I'm still not certain quite where it fits in or how it fits in, and that's something that's still pursuing there. Stuart's question around rural, don't apologise, I'm much happier asking a question about reality, and I think it's and it goes back to the heart of what we're trying to do in this project, and indeed much of my other work. Because it's absolutely true. Certainly one starts, say, from a more political economic point of view, and try to actually distinguish what is rural and urban today. You do any kind of analysis of those forms. Certainly you do approach this from a relational point of view and look at the connections, then it is extremely hard, or impossible, to differentiate urban and rural space. The point I come back to consistently is however much you seek to explain away the rural in such ways, reality has a strange power out there, that it has a power which matters in terms of how people identify themselves. It has a matter about how so-called rural spaces get commodified. It matters in terms of how they get regulated, in terms of how the landscape gets produced and reproduced. It matters in terms of political mobilisation, which links back to my previous work on rural protest. Reality, however much we may want to treat it as a fiction, still versus and still out there. And that's what's partly my, I suppose, my larger intellectual agenda of being interested in this as a phrase. When we start then, so again, I got into the work around globalization and the rural, partly in terms of, again, thinking about bringing the rural back into work on globalization, that we kind of turn global countryside quite explicitly as a counter to the global city. And I'm not thinking about this as two discrete spaces, but in order to actually draw some attention back into rural areas and to force us perhaps to think about what may then make them different and distinguished from cities. Now, I think you follow that through into an assemblage approach and so on, then I think you do we start thinking about place assemblages. We think about places being assemblages and whether those are cities, towns, localities, regions, nations, whatever they may be. One of the ways in which they get coded is coded as being urban or rural. So I think we can then see rural as part of that coding process. If we start to then think about the interconnectivities, then clearly rural areas are heavily interconnected to urban areas, and vice versa. And our urban areas are interconnected with urban areas, rural areas are interconnected with other rural areas. And trying to, from any, if you like, objective sense of drawing a line and saying this is what one ends and the other doesn't, is impossible because they are interdependent. Again, look at ideas about how an assemblage is territorialised. Then a place assemblage, which they say rural district, does get territorialised through measures such as the framing of a administrative unit and drawing a boundary which says this is the edge of this county, this is the edge of this district, this is the edge of this, these are the urban limits here, this is where the speed limit changes, this is whatever it might be, there's certain ways in which territorialisation takes place, which it does again imagine a boundary space between the two. And in social and economic terms, that has very real meaning, but it does start to articulate those. So that's where I start considering that there are ways in which the rural is being constructed as separate from the urban, what's also being interconnected, interdependent, all kinds of other ways. And I think I just want to, first I want to recognise that, to draw attention to those rural spaces as well as the urban spaces, and in doing so to try to treat each as being equivalent. Because my critique of the kind of planetary urbanism, extended urbanised literature, is not that it seeks to dissolve the urban and rural, but it seeks to impose the urban over those spaces. And therefore what it's doing is privileging the urban over rural. And I think that reinforces senses which are there of the urban being a space in which, for example, globalisation is reproduced as opposed to rural, or the urban being identified as certain forms of social interaction, of economic activity, which if we then see being identified in rural spaces becomes urbanisation. And I think there is a sense of an asymmetry in that relationship which that those particular ideas articulate. And I think the main thing I'd want to challenge is not to say I want to see the rural as being a discrete space, but to challenge the power dynamics I see explicit in that, and to treat the rural as a equally valid starting point for exploring these spatial relationships and exploring how they're being developed in globalisation.
Okay. There are plenty of other questions, I know. However, given that Mike's almost been going for 2 hours now, I think it is only right and proper that we give the man a break. So, before I turn to our conference organisers for perhaps not the last but penultimate word, can you join me in thanking Michael for a really terrific masterclass in some of the biggest concepts, I think, not only in geography and politics, but the humanities and social sciences today. So thank you very much indeed, Mike, for that.